Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis and we'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. I'm recording this share the morning of Erev Tisha B'Av. I want to make sure to get the share in before Chatzos. Those of you, if you remember, we learned the halacha in Hilchos Tisha B'Av. The Ramah brings down that we're noig not to learn after Chatzos on Erev Tisha B'Av. However, he does say that those that are mekel and they do learn after Chatzos and Erev Tisha B'Av, ein moichin, you can't object to them. There's a lengthy beer halacha that we learn, who basically says that the reason that they were noig not to learn after Chatzos and Erev Tisha B'Av is because there's plenty of things to learn that are mutter to learn on Tisha B'Av. So what's the problem? So learn Hilchos Tisha B'Av, learn Iyuv, learn the Gemaras in Gittin and Hanazakin that speak about the Churban. So they felt that there's no big downside in answering learning Erev Tisha B'Av after Chatzos. However, the Chavetz Chaim writes in the Bir Halacha, and he brings down from quite a few people, the idea we know, Ein Adam Loimed Elamal Shalibay Chafetz. People are only really going to learn what they take joy in learning, what they get sipak hanefesh from learning. And therefore the Chavetz Chaim kind of takes the position that to go ahead and aser learning and say don't learn on Erev Tisha B'Av because you could learn things that are mutter is going to be gairim a tremendous amount of bittul Torah. And therefore he comes out and he says, the Ramah says that we don't learn Erev Tisha B'Av after Chatzos, but if somebody's mekel and he does learn after Chatzos, you cannot be moicha. For this shir, I didn't want to put out a shir for the rabbim after Chatzos, so I'm putting out the shir before Chatzos. In any case, we're on Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Beis HaKnesses. We're in this fascinating Siman Kuf Nun Gimel. We're still in the midst of Siv Zayin. So yesterday we went through at great length the question of selling a Beis HaKnesses and the difference between selling a Beis HaKnesses in a kvar, in a small town, and selling a Beis HaKnesses in a krach, in a large city, which we defined as not so much a large city, but a city which is a destination point where people come to it from all over the place. So we went through this at length yesterday, and the last halacha that we learned yesterday was that even in a krach, where we say that it's not pashut to sell a Beis HaKnesses, and the reason is because in a krach, we assume that when the Beis HaKnesses was built, the Beis HaKnesses was not only built for the use of the locals, the Beis HaKnesses was built having in mind the wider Jewish community, and therefore the wider Jewish community are considered to be the bailim. They have an ownership, sort of, in the Beis HaKnesses. They have a bailus over that Beis HaKnesses, and therefore the local townspeople are not authorized to sell the shul out from under them. But the Mechaber said there is a case where you can. Now we learned that there are several cases where you can. You could sell the shul of a krach if we know for sure that when it was built with a t'nai that it was not built for the wider Jewish community, that it was built really for the purposes of the locals. But the Mechaber tells us another case, and that is, the Mechaber says, if when the Beis HaKnesses in the krach was built, all of the authority to make decisions pertaining to this Beis HaKnesses, all of that authority was invested in one person, then that person always retains the authority to go ahead and sell the Beis HaKnesses. Now, that's not dependent on that one individual saying, when I built the shul 30 years ago, I built it al das the townspeople alone. I didn't build it al das kala olam kulay. No, it's not dependent on that. All it's dependent on is, if when the Beis HaKnesses was built, all of the authority to make decisions pertaining to the Beis HaKnesses were invested in one individual, then that individual has a level of authority that allows him to sell the shul, even though there are people in the wider Jewish community who we would think have a certain level of bailus over the shul. It doesn't matter. This individual has so much power, so much authority over the shul that he's allowed to sell the shul, despite the fact that the shul may have been built al das kol ha'olam kulay. And again, I'm basing this on what I have seen in the Aruch HaShulchan. And I mentioned yesterday, we have a precedent for this in a Bir Halacha that we learned yesterday that says in a region where the minig is that there is a kind of a super powerful committee or board that has the authority over Inyonei Tzibur, like the Bir Halacha said, and they have makel uritzua. They're so powerful that it's as if they have a rod and a whipping strap. In other words, these are people who have unquestioned authority. Then they too are permitted to sell even the Beis HaKnesses of a krach, even though we might think that you're selling it out from people around the world. It doesn't matter. They're authorized to do that anyway. Now, we get up to now the first halakha that we're going to learn today, which we read it yesterday, but we didn't do the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is Katan Lamed Vav. The Mechaber said that even this individual who has so much authority that he's allowed to sell the shul of a krach, he has to do it b'haskamas hatzibur. He has to do it with the agreement of the tzibur. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice Katan Lamed Vav, b'haskamas hatzibur. Why does he need the haskama of the tzibur? If he's so powerful, why does he need haskamas hatzibur? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Devadai loy hayadaitam sheyimkar hayachid beis haknesses shalahem loy daitam. The Chavetz Chaim says the reason the Mechaber says he needs haskamas hatzibur is because, yes, the tzibur invested him with a tremendous amount of authority, but certainly they didn't invest in him the power to go and sell the shul out from under them without their haskama. No tzibur would give one individual that level of power. Ella, says the Chavetz Chaim, lahachi ahani das hayochid. What is the authority that this person has? What is his das able to accomplish? Deloi boy tuvei yo'ir. He doesn't need any other committee of the city. He doesn't need design tuvei yo'ir. Rak b'mayim anshe ir levad. As long as he consults with the people of the town, he's authorized to sell it all on his own. And nobody else in the wider world can stop him from selling the shul. They can't come and protest, hey, you're not allowed to sell the shul out from under us. The answer is yes, he can, because he's invested with that much authority. Now, if the tzibur did a very interesting thing, and that is that they authorized beferish, they clearly authorized this individual to take whatever actions he wants to take, even without consulting with them, even without gaining their agreement, then ain't tzarich lasos paskamasam. Then in a chinami, he doesn't need their haskama. He says that we should take a look here at the Bir Halacha. So the Bir Halacha says over here that it would seem from the reading of the Mechaber, and definitely based on what we just saw here in the Mishnah Berurah, that should this single individual attempt to sell the shul without gaining the haskama of the tzibur, it would seem that the sale is not binding. But the Bir Halacha brings down over here from the Bir Agra, he seems to say that no, it's not true. Just like we learned by the Beis HaKnesses of a Kfar, that the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir could sell the shul without the agreement, without consulting with the Anshe Ha'ir. They're empowered to do that. The only thing is, if they do, then the money retains its Kedusha, and it is encumbered by the restrictions of Sif Beis. But in a Kfar, if the Zayin Tuvei Ha'ir get up and sell the shul, even if they did it without consultation with the townsfolk, we learned that sale is a binding sale. Says the Bir Agra, so too when it comes to the Beis HaKnesses of a krach. If the power to make all decisions pertaining to the shul was invested in a single individual, then that single individual, should he up and sell the shul without gaining the haskama of the tzibur, maybe what he did wasn't right, but the sale is binding. Okay. And the money will retain its kedusha, says the Bir Agra. Now, I mentioned yesterday that the Aruch HaShulchan also asks this question on this halacha: if this single individual is invested with so much authority, why is it that he needs the haskamas hatzibur? That's the question that the Chavetz Chaim is answering over here. The Chavetz Chaim's answer is because it's inconceivable that the tzibur would invest so much authority in a single individual that they would allow him to sell the shul without consulting with them first. That's the Chavetz Chaim's answer. The Aruch HaShulchan's answer is a more technical answer. The Aruch HaShulchan's answer is, even though the authority to make all decisions was invested in this single individual, but the lashon of the Aruch HaShulchan was that it's soifai k'may tchilasai. Just like he was invested with the authority to make all decisions pertaining to the shul by the tzibur, and that's what gives him the kayak and the authority to make those decisions. When he wants to end his tenure, so to speak, by selling the shul, that also has to be done by Haskamas HaTzibur. The origination of his authority, the origination of the shul project, was done by the Haskamas HaTzibur. So too the termination of the project and the termination of his authority has to be done with Haskamas HaTzibur. Okay. Now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. Middle of the line, top line in the Mechaber, right by the Ois Kat Lam Zayin for the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber, V'hu hadin l'chol divrei kedusha shenizkeru kan. The same halacha that we just learned, the concept that when you have a Beis HaKnesses in a krach, since the Beis HaKnesses of the krach was built adaita de kol ha'olam, it was built having the wider Jewish community in mind, and therefore the townspeople cannot necessarily sell the Beis HaKnesses of the krach, because they need to gain the acquiescence of everybody else in the wider Jewish community. Says the Mechaber now, the same halacha would apply to other dvarim shebekedusha that are in the Beis HaKnesses, de kulahu geriri basar Beis HaKnesses, because the halacha of all the dvarim shebekedusha in the Beis HaKnesses follow and are pulled along with the din of the Beis HaKnesses itself. What does this mean? Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah's Kat Lamed Zayin. V'hu l'chol divrei kedusha pirish. The explanation in this mechaber is kigoyin, for example, teva the Aron Kodesh, umitpachas, or the wrappings, the mantelach and the gartelach of the Sifrei Torah, v'chadoyme, or other similar dvarim shebekedusha hanizkar b'sif beis, all the types of dvarim shebekedusha that we mentioned in Sif Beis, like Sifrei Kodesh, etc. Dinam k'may Beis HaKnesses atzmai, they gain the same halacha as the Beis HaKnesses itself, le'inyin zeh, in the context of these halachas. D'chol heichi d'eu naisa adaita d'kulei alma. If we're talking about a shul that was made for the purposes of the wider Jewish community, like the Beis HaKnesses of a destination krach, kigoyin de krachim, so then hanoch nami. So then these dvarim shebekdusha that are located in the Beis HaKnesses, hanoch nami nasu mistama adaita d'kulei alma. So too all the other dvarim shebekdusha in the shul. If we're going to say that the shul in Borough Park was built adaita d'kol ha'olam, because people recognize that Brooklyn is a destination, or Lakewood is a destination, or Bnei Brak is a destination. So if we're going to say that the Batei Knesiyos that are built in those locales have the din of a bezdin of a krach, and therefore there's a question about the ability to sell the Beis HaKnesses because the wider Jewish community has bailus over it, so too all the dvarim shebekdusha that are located in the shul. The Sefer Torah that's in the shul, it wasn't bought just for the purposes of the local townspeople. It was bought to serve this Beis HaKnesses, and this Beis HaKnesses was built to serve the wider Jewish community. So all of the dvarim shebekdusha in the Beis HaKnesses are pulled along with the Beis HaKnesses, and they get the din of the Beis HaKnesses. And this is what the Mechaber means when he writes, "Tekulahu geriri basar Beis HaKnesses," that all of these things are pulled along together with the Beis HaKnesses. They get the status of the Beis HaKnesses that they're in. V'chein kol davar hashayach leBeis HaKnesses, and so too this halacha would apply to anything that belongs to the Beis HaKnesses. Kigoyin chatzeros, like the courtyards of the Beis HaKnesses, oy mikvah, or if the shul has a mikvah, Arminan Gam Kain Ki Gavna, Veloy Motzi Lamachran, and they cannot be sold, Oila Sagran, they cannot be closed down, Limnoy Mehen Archin, to block guests and travelers that come to the city from using them. Because what do you mean? It was built for them. Nevertheless, like Chomer be basic Knesses, they certainly don't get a more Chomer Dikadin than the shul itself. V'chein similarly, Mashinizkar b'sif zeh, also, the halacha that we learned in this sif, the Shiva Tuvei Ir b'mayben anshe Ir b'kfarim, that if you're talking about a small town, the Zayin Tuvei Ir, with consultation with the townsfolk, Yechaylim lahaitzi adamim l'chulin, they're able to sell a Beis HaKnesses and even be mafkia the kedusha off the money, and now you could use the money for a shul barbecue. Lav davka beBeis HaKnesses. This doesn't only apply to the shul itself. Ela afilu b'tashmishi hakdusha din kain. The same halacha would apply to the tashmishi kedusha in the shul. So, if you have a shul in a kvar, you have a Beis HaKnesses in a kvar in a small town, where we don't have the issue that people from outside the town could block the sale, because the Beis HaKnesses of a kfar was clearly only built for the people of the kfar. So we said, if the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'maymen anshe Ir sell the shul, they're allowed to sell the shul, no one can block them, and not only they're allowed to sell the shul, but they could be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds of the sale. Says the Mishnah Berurah now, so too in the Beis HaKnesses of a kfar, if the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'mayben anshe Ir want to sell some of the Tashmishe Kedusha, they have an extra Aron Kodesh. They upgraded, they have a Shabbos shul and a weekday shul, they upgraded the Aron Kodesh to the weekday shul, now they have the old Aron Kodesh for the weekday shul. It's Tashmishe Kedusha. Are they allowed to sell it? Yes, they're allowed to sell it. They have sole bailus over it, so they're allowed to sell it. Not only they're allowed to sell it, but if it's sold by the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'mayben anshe Ir, so the board goes ahead and calls a general membership meeting, and they say we're selling the old Aron Kodesh from the weekday shul, they're allowed to sell it, and they take the kedusha off the proceeds. When the proceeds of the sale come in, they can make a shul barbecue, they can use it for chulin. But there's one important caveat that must be remembered, says the Mishnah Berurah. Ach, mikam makam yesh chilik beinayu. There still is a difference between selling the Beis HaKnesses by the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'maymen anshe Ir and selling Tashmishe Kedusha like an Aron Kodesh. What's the difference? The Tashmishe Kedusha, if you're going to sell an Aron Kodesh, after mutter lehishtamish b'demeim kishenimkar b'shiva Tuvei Ir b'maymen anshe Ir b'kvarim, even though, in this case, you go ahead and you sell an Aron Kodesh from the Beis HaKnesses of a kfar, and the sale is done by the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'maymen anshe Ir, even though the halacha is that you could use those proceeds for chulin, because you could be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds, mikamoka beheim gufa b'kedusha sayu kaimi, biyad hakoine, biyad alikeach, but the Aron Kodesh is still an Aron Kodesh. So in other words, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, yes, they're allowed to sell the Aron Kodesh because they have sole bailus over the Aron Kodesh. They're allowed to be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds of the sale because the Zayin Tuvei Ir b'maymen anshe Ir have the authority to say that we no longer need this Aron Kodesh, we're selling it. The money that comes in is only secondary kedusha, and we could be mafkia the kedusha off the money. Remember, we learned a Dirshu footnote that said that the mechanism of this, according to one shita, the mechanism of this is that the money doesn't have intrinsic kedusha. The money that comes in doesn't have intrinsic kedusha. It's secondary kedusha. So that's klisha kedusha sayu. The kedusha is weak. So that the Zayin Tuvei Ir, and if it's done by b'maymen anshe Ir, they could be mafkia the kedusha off the proceeds of the sale of the Aron Kodesh, but they can't be mafkia the kedusha off the Aron Kodesh. Now remember, we learned yesterday that to be mafkia the kedusha off the Beis HaKnesses, that they could do. Why? Because the Beis HaKnesses is tashmishe mitzvah. The Beis HaKnesses is like a used lulav. It's like a used aravas or hadassim. Those are tashmishe mitzvah. Once the mitzvah is over, tashmishe mitzvah nizraken. You can throw them away as long as it's not thrown away by Ifid B'Zayin. But they don't retain inherent kedusha. But an Aron Kodesh is not tashmishe mitzvah. An Aron Kodesh is tashmishe kedusha. Tashmishe kedusha, the Gemara in Megillah says, nignozen. Tashmishe kedusha cannot be nizraken. They retain kedusha. So that designed to the ear, even b'mayim anshe ear, they cannot be mafkia kedusha off tashmishe kedusha. They can't go declare an Aron Kodesh as no longer being an Aron Kodesh, so that now somebody could use it as a wardrobe. That they can't do. The kedusha is a guf ninu. They don't have the power to take off kedusha as a guf. Avo beis hakneses v'tashmishe mitzvah, but beis hakneses and other tashmishe mitzvah, motor lehishtamish ben, you could use them for other things. So when it comes to selling the beis hakneses of a kfar, the zayin tuve ir b'mayim anshe ir could sell the beis hakneses. They could be mafkia the proceeds to chulin, and they could even take the kedusha off the beis hakneses itself. And now the lekech could use the beis hakneses as a house. It might be said. It strikes me when I drive to Yeshiva Staten Island's camp in Kerhankson. You go down the road, and there's a house that I saw this house. I would pass it by the decades. I'm passing by this house, and I always looked at it, and I always said, there's no question that this house was once upon a time a shul. It has a piece sticking out on one side of the shul, on one side of the building, that clearly must have been an Aron Kodesh. And right above it is a round stained glass window. So I always drove by this house and I said, this house must have been a shul. Finally, I did the research and I found out it was a beis hakneses. Now it's a house. There's the Eina Yehudim living there in the house. Now I don't know exactly who made the sale, what, when, where, how, but definitely Kerhankson is a kvar. And it's a beis hakneses shel kvar. It's not a destination point where people are coming from all over. It might be now, because now my Rebbe's all Stark Reuven Feinstein is there in Kerhankson, and people can come from all over to come see him. So maybe now Kerhankson would actually have a din of a krach. It's a destination point. And maybe Yeshiva Staten Island just built a new Beis Medrash. Maybe that Beis Medrash is considered a Beis Medrash that's built adaita de kol ha'olam, because it's a destination point. I'm not so sure. Could also be that it was built beferish just for the camp. But in any case, that old beis hakneses, believe me, when that was in the 1930s and 40s, that was definitely, Kerhankson was definitely a kvar. So if there were zayin tuvi ir, if there was a board, so if the board sold it b'mayim anshe ir, they made a meeting, they voted, they went ahead, they sold the shul, they could mafkia the kedusha off the house, off the beis hakneses, it could be used as a house. But that's because a beis hakneses is tashmishe mitzvah. An Aron Kodesh is tashmishe kedusha. They don't have the power to take kedusha as a guf off of the Aron Kodesh. V'ayil kamam b'sif yod b'sif kuf tadal sif gimel Mishnah Berurah bir halacha. So the Mechaber said that all of the dvarim shebekdusha in the beis hakneses are pulled along with the beis hakneses itself. They get the same status in halacha as the beis hakneses. The kulhu geriri basar beis hakneses, kol kalei beis hakneses, all of the utensils of the beis hakneses, v'safsalim, the benches, the tables, the chairs, v'yariyos, the tablecloths, the curtains, shebe beis hakneses, dinam ke beis hakneses. They all have the same din as the shul. Valkein, and therefore, kishamachru shivatu v'yir b'mayim anshe yir b'kvarim. If you're talking about a small town, a kvar, and if the sale of the beis hakneses was done by the Shiva Tuvia Ir B'mayim Anshe Ir, Yechalim Lehishtamish B'mois L'cham Asher Yirtzu, they can use the proceeds for whatever they want. V'yelav hachiloi. Keinu L'fi Pashtus Divrei Magen Avram Shetik Divrei Aran B'Shem Yerushalmi Al Divrei Shulchan Aruch. L'b'sei v'karvitz al Rambam B'chas Tefillah Perek Yud Aleph Kosav. They write that according to the Rambam, the Nira Loi Da'afilu B'krachim Yechalim L'machar L'Divrei Aran, that this would hold true even in a krach. The dafkel inin mecheres pesach knesses gufa arminan delay machli rabim chelkam l'shiva tuvi ir masheke bazeh v'lachen yochel agabe l'machor b'tzir fanchei ir l'hoitzi avois l'chulin. Okay, I just read these brackets very quickly. He's bringing down over here from the Sefer Kovitz al Rambam in Hilchas Tefillah. We're saying now that all of the utensils, tablecloths, curtains of the Beis HaKnesses, they all get the same din as the Beis HaKnesses. Now, if they have the same din as a Beis HaKnesses, so then we know that the halach is a Beis HaKnesses shel krach, a Beis HaKnesses of a destination city. It's not so pashut to sell it, because people all over the world have a level of bailus over the Beis HaKnesses. According to what we just learned in the Mechaber, the same halacha would be true in a Beis HaKnesses shel krach. If the Gaboim decide that they want to sell the curtains, they have no right to sell the curtains, because they don't have sole bailus over the curtains. The same way the city doesn't have sole bailus over the shul, because the shul was built adaita the kol olam kulai, so too they don't have sole bailus over the curtains, over the tables, over the chairs. There's people in 100 miles away who also have bailus over the kalim of the Beis HaKnesses. That's what we were saying. He brings down over here that it's possible that according to the Rambam, it's not that way. Why? The logic would be, look, somebody who lives 100 miles away might protest that, wait a second, you're selling the shul out from under me. I count on that shul. Thousands of people who come from all over the world count on that shul. You can't sell the shul out from under us. But no one's going to come and complain and say, what, you sold the curtains? How could you sell the curtains out from under us? That logically doesn't make sense. That's what this Shita says. Okay. Now we go back to the Shulchan Aruch, second line down, the words of the Ramah. Hagah. Yachid shebana beis haknesses. A single individual, a very generous individual, goes ahead in the town and he builds a shul. His own funds, his own money, everything else. He goes and he builds a shul. Unisan ala kohol. And then he donates it to the tzibur. Says the Ramah, Dina kebeis haknesses shal kol. It has the same din as a regular shul belonging to the kehillah. It's very nice. You built it from your own funds. And then you went ahead and you donated it to the kehillah. So now it belongs to the kehillah. And all of the halachas that we learned until now would fully apply. Aval, however, im shir la'atzboi b'shum kayach, but if he donated it to the kehillah, but he told the kehillah, but I'm retaining certain decision-making rights over the shul. I built a $3 million shul with my own money. I'm not just giving it away flat out that I have no kayach. I'm giving it out, but if there are significant decisions that have to be made pertaining to the shul, I'm retaining some power over here. Says the Ramah, in that case, im shir la'atzma b'shum kayach, ein la mecher, then the shul cannot be sold. Ki im al pi ha'kohol, it has to be with the agreement of the tzibur, ve'al piv, and you need his agreement as well, a yarshav, or his inheritors. Says the Mishnah Berurah. And the kehillah could sell the shul on their own, and they don't even have to consult with the donor. Okay, let's go weiter. The last line here in the Ramah, Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. All of this, all of what? All of these halachas that we have said until now, where we have said that you're allowed to sell the Beis HaKnesses of a kfar. If the townspeople want to sell it, they could sell it. You're allowed to sell the Beis HaKnesses of a krach in certain cases. Let's say it was built with investing a single individual with all the authority. He could go ahead and he could sell it. Or if we know that there was a Tanai Beferish, that it was only built for the locals, then the locals could sell it. The cholzeh, all of this, says the Ramah, the ability to sell these batei knesiyos are all only assuming that there's another Beis HaKnesses available for the tzibur. But if they only have one shul, then, says the Ramah, then you're not allowed to sell it. Because we know that even if you want to knock it down in order to build a new shul, you're not allowed to do it unless you build the new shul first. So the Ramah is telling us, now we've spent all of this time learning about selling a shul. hey, you can only sell the shul if there's another shul. You can't leave the tzibur without a shul. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut mem aleph. V'chol zeh. I'm sorry, cut mem. V'chol zeh. This whole discussion, pirush. This whole conversation about shuls that you're allowed to sell is only when there's another shul. Magen Avram Pirish, the Magen Avram explains the Ribbono Shel Olam that what the Ramah wants to say is when he says it's only if there's another shul, the Magen Avram ups the ante. The Magen Avram says he doesn't mean that if the town has two shuls, now in these cases you could sell one of them. No, what he means is the Ribbono Shel Olam when you're building now a replacement for the one that you want to sell. But if there are two shuls in the town, in other words, what the Magen Avram is saying, don't misunderstand the Ramah. You might look at the Ramah and you might say like this: we just had a whole lengthy conversation about selling a shul, and we said you could sell a basic shel kfar, you could sell a basic shel krach under certain circumstances. Says the Ramah, that's only if there's another shul. Okay, so you might think if there's a town that has two shuls, or there are three shuls, and they want to sell one of them, so okay, if it meets the requirements that we've learned about until now, you're allowed to sell it. And now, even though up till now there were three shuls in town, now there will only be two, because it's a kvar. Since it's a kvar, I'm allowed to sell a shul. Or it's a krach, but this shul was built al das yachid, so I'm allowed to sell it. So until now there were three shuls in town, now there'll only be two. Says the Magen Avram, no, that's not what the Ramah means. What the Ramah is saying is, this whole discussion about selling the shul, that's only if you're building a replacement for the shul that you're selling. But you're not allowed to cut down the town from having three shuls to having two, or from having two shuls to having one. He says he can't do that. If there were two shuls there originally, you're not allowed to sell one. That's the sheet of the Magen Avram. And now we saw an Igros Moshe earlier, brought down on one of the Dirshu footnotes, who goes into this a little bit. He says, because it's important sometimes for a town to have two shuls. Maybe there are people who live closer to one than the other one, and during the winter months when it's cold outside, if you sell the second shul, they're not going to go to the first shul. Or maybe one is Nusach Ashkenaz and one is Nusach Sfard. Maybe one is a Chassidish Shtibel and one is a Young Israel. So you need both. So it's not so pashut just to say, since there are two shuls, we could sell one. That's the Magen Avram. Avola Taz Bereish Siman Kuf Nun Beis. But according to the Taz, in the beginning of Siman Kuf Nun Beis of Katan Aleph, Mutar Afilu Ba'ifet Zeh, he disagrees. And he says there are two shuls, you can sell one and cut it down to one. V'chein das el Yerah b'sham kavasei. V'chein mashmi mibir agra. Aval kol zeh dafke kishoyse beis hakneses meruva chuva u'machzik l'kulam. But says the Mishnah Berurah, even according to the Taz and these other Achronim, that's only if the shul that's left in town is big enough to accommodate everyone. If it's not big enough to accommodate everyone, so very nice, there's another shul in town. So what? It can't accommodate everyone. Even in significant cities, if you build a bigger, nicer, better shul, mutter listar harishayni, you're allowed to knock down the first one. Because all the other people of the world will be happy. I mean, I can tell you, this reminds me, for many years when I went up to the mountains during the summer, if I needed a minyan for Shachris, let's say I was in Yeshiva Staten Island's camp, so the last Shachris is 7:30. If I wanted to daven a Shachris at 8:30 one morning, so where did I go? I got in my car, I drove down Route 52, and I went to Klosenberg. Now, I remember the old Klosenberger Beis HaMedrash over there. It was one of these old Catskill bungalow stilt building situations. It was big, it was a Beis HaKnesses, but that's what there was. Now, that's a perfect case in point where you have a Beis HaKnesses of what I would say is a Beis HaKnesses shel krach. That's something that's built, and it's serving the whole wider Catskill community over there. It's serving South Fallsburg and Woodburn and Woodridge and Fallsburg and Ellenville. It's serving all of these communities. That's the Minyan Factory. It's one of the big Minyan factories up in the mountains. Then they went there, they knocked it down, and they built something 10 times the size. I was very happy. I was nostalgic for the old building where I used to see the Friedrich Klausenberg Rebbe, but at the same time, I was very happy to pull up and see a big, beautiful base of Knesset, much nicer, much more modern, and many, many, many rooms able to accommodate many, many, many more minyanim. So the people of the world aren't going to protest if you knock down the old shul and build something bigger and nicer. Ukvar Taktu Zela El B'Sibik Kuftun Beis of Cotton Zion. Mishnah Berurah says we already brought down this Tazi Kuftun Beis. V'chein similarly Eitzim Va'avanim Erishayna, the sticks and stones, the building materials from the first shul. Borto lehishtamesh behem lo yitzion lechulin. Al pi shivatu v'yir b'maymin anshe ha'ir. We could be mafkia the kedusha off the rubble of the original shul. It's tashmishay mitzvah. We don't need it anymore. If you don't have another shul, it's usher to sell the first one. Even if it's a kfar, even if it's shivatuviyir b'maymin anshe ha'ir, if you're gonna leave the people without a shul, you can't sell it. And this is true even if you want to sell the existing shul in order to purchase a new shul. Domya distira, it's like demolishing a shul. The asar afilu ba'ifin zeh. Ois cotton mem gimel lamachrai, you're not allowed to sell it. Im loy sheyirtzu liknais b'dama macheres begamdu deleka lamechash l'pshiyusa. Unless what you're trying to do is you're trying to sell the original shul in order to take the proceeds and purchase the new shul. And it's a case where we don't have to worry that anything might go wrong between when you sell the first shul and buy the second shul. Kigoyin, for example, shemizumin beis haknesses likach, the second shul is already built. Ve'enei chaser elo nesinas hamois. We're here by the closing, so we're ready to close on the new shul. We need the proceeds from the first shul in order to close on the second shul. So then we can finalize the sale of the first shul, get the proceeds, go to the closing on the new shul. Okay? We're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be banging against Klal Yisrael. Ribbono Shel Olam should say Yeshua's, Refuah's, Parnasset, Sheduchim to all those in need. And here on Erev Tisha B'Av, I'm going to say we should be Zaycha to see the Bias Gold Tzedek V'Mherav Yameinu Amen. We shouldn't have to fast. We shouldn't have any more Tisha B'Avs. Tisha B'Av should ikri ma'id. Chazal say that one day Tisha B'Av will be called a Yom Tov. That's why we don't say Tachna today by Mincha. We don't say Tachna today by Mincha because Tisha B'Av is called a ma'id. So Mirz Hashem, we should be Zaycha to see now, today, we should be Zaycha to see that Tisha B'Av should be Nepach, L'mayid, or L'simcha. Be well.